Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's lecture featuring Max Bearak, who's climate reporter for the New York Times. I'm Nicholas Ryan. I'm the head of the Energy, Climate, and Growth Initiative at the Economic Growth Center at Yale. It's part of the economics department. We have a fantastic session today. Max's work is incredible, globe-spanning in a literal sense. He's reported on floods from Pakistan, on climate negotiations in Azerbaijan, on the lungs of the earth from the rainforest of Colombia. And what's really incredible and sort of inspires us is that it has this vertical span. It's not just spanning the globe, but really spanning from the ground level, the realities and the lived experience of people who are suffering from climate change, all the way to the sort of halls of power, if you will, where policies are being set and rules decided that have these impacts. And he's trying to trace things all the way from the top to the bottom. So this is inspiring for us. I will sort of also introduce our panelists, but I'll defer until after Max's talk. For now, I would just say, if you're joining sort of here in the hall, we're also online, live, and going to be recorded. And so by being in the hall, you're consenting to be recorded, and sort of any questions that you ask may be on there too. So just briefly, by way of background, prior to the New York Times, Max had also worked at the Washington Post. He's reported not only on climate and environmental issues, but also on Ukraine, on other issues, and extensively on South Asia, which is a common point of interest for myself. A lot of my research on energy and environment concerns clean energy adoption and environmental regulation in India. So before we welcome Max, I'd just like to ask if you could, put your hands together, give him a very warm welcome. We're very glad to have him here.
Thanks, Nick. That was really kind of you, and thanks to you all for coming. I hope I won't bore you, because while you're all evidently interested in climate justice and climate change, sometimes my articles get so few readers that I have trouble believing that many people care. But in any case, they've given me 40 minutes. I'm not sure that I will take that full time, but I'll say what I feel needs to be said, and hopefully that can be the basis for a great discussion with the professors on the panel. It's okay?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you. Sorry.
How is it now? So when I was asked to give a title for this lecture, I chose something that I felt knowledgeable and passionate about, which is climate justice in kind of the biggest idea form. Why is it so hard for rich countries to support poorer ones when both the culpability for the climate crisis and its causes and the raw reality of who suffers its worst effects are essentially well-established facts? But I have to say that the subject has felt a great deal more twee since Trump took office. It was one thing for Trump to call climate change a hoax during his first term, but the spin by the current administration has been to firmly put climate in the American culture war by saying that climate change is not just a hoax, but a scam. An industry that's designed by liberal billionaires, maybe the Chinese Communist Party, to alarm and dupe and control Americans. Essentially a nefarious plot created by a cabal of scientists working with the deep state to force you to buy electric vehicles, to stop using gas stoves. And to some extent, these conspiracy theories are circulating in Europe, too. But of course, the question of how we get rich countries to cough up more money has never felt more urgent. That's kind of the thing with climate change, is the ever-increasing urgency. Global warming is speeding up. nearly 8 in 10 units of energy we produce in the world still derive from sources that contribute to that acceleration. Coal, oil, and gas are at all-time production highs, and that's thanks in the US to both Democrats and Republicans. So in a very brief sense, that is, at least in this country, the situation as it stands. My job at the New York Times is to cover our species' collective effort to both understand and address climate change. And to do that, I cover, as Nick was saying, I cover negotiations. I also cover major energy projects. I cover the carbon market. I cover global institutions like the World Bank, which, banks of different kinds driving tens of billions of dollars into the climate effort. And through that reporting, I think where I come down is I think we're at a very perplexing moment right now. The global energy transition away from fossil fuels, which is our main way to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, is gaining steam in some places and faltering in many others. And instead of a concerted, global, coordinated effort to propel this transition, we're seeing a great deal of disagreement over even the most basic questions of how to approach the problem. But if you were to read my articles only about climate negotiations, which are often billed as kind of the premier platform to, for this collective effort, I'd forgive you for thinking that the issue does come down to money, as you might take away from the title of the talk that we chose, Why Are Rich Countries Failing Poor Ones? That this comes down to stingy rich countries who are loath to accept blame, who are refusing to cough up the necessary amount of money for this transition and to help poor countries do the same thing. The idea essentially is, sure, there are rivalries and geopolitics, but it's nothing that a bit of subsidies or rebudgeting couldn't fix if we just agreed on the price tag and who is on the hook for the bill. These negotiations, there's a whole world of climate finance discourse, which I won't get too deeply into now, but it revolves around essentially whether rich countries can muster a very specific amount of money. Last year at COP, the kind of developing world had asked for $1.3 trillion over a certain amount of time, and donor countries agreed to provide $300 billion. It was this kind of fight of, can we get to a specific number? And they're asking questions like, can we give loans at certain rates to poorer countries? Can we chip into certain funds that poor countries can dip into? Can we even answer the question of whether a country is a rich one or a poor one? Is China or Saudi Arabia or Singapore a rich country or a poor country? Is the UAE on the hook for the bill, even if they haven't historically contributed as much greenhouse gases as the UK or the United States, and so on? But I think, I don't want you to get me wrong. I think these are important questions to answer, and I think that the money is important too. But what I want to make sure is that you don't come away from what I'm saying with the impression, as it might seem in the title's framing, that money alone is the solution to the climate crisis. And I think the solution is way more difficult, I'm afraid to say. And I promise that I'm not going to be a total downer. I will get to the shimmers of light that I see. Not solutions exactly, but shimmers per se. But I do need to first lay out, I think, a few brief ideas before I get to that optimism. And the ideas that I'm going to lay out are far from my own, or something that I have come up with, but it's kind of put together from lots of different thinkers, on questions that have been pondered since Aristotle and presumably far earlier even than that, and that largely revolve around what we sometimes call as the tragedy of the commons. And what I want to talk about is how I think climate change might help push us forward addressing that fundamental issue. So in Aristotle's words, he says, "That which is common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care. Men pay most attention to what is their own. They care less for what is common. And what's common to the greatest number of us, the biggest of the things that we share, not just with each other, but with every living being on the planet, is our reliance on it and its natural systems to deliver sustenance and life to all of us." It's an obvious thing to say, a very meta thing to say, but that is what we all share. But in basically any modern economic system, capitalist, socialist, communist, those services that the earth provides are taken for granted, are barely included as inputs. These are services like predictable seasons or sufficient rainfall or cold, nutrient-rich ocean currents that deliver bountiful fish. A few years ago, the Treasury of the United Kingdom charged an economist at Cambridge, Partha Dasgupta, with compiling a study of how to shift the study of economics more broadly to better incorporate natural services, like I was just talking about, as actual financial assets. And this isn't the only one. We were just talking before this about how the French government has done the same, and I'm sure others have too. But the idea basically being that assets are essential components of how we value a company or a national GDP. But the way that we do it now doesn't account for these services. We sometimes account for land more broadly, but not the services that are provided by nature. And in the review that Dasgupta eventually produced, he's saying we need to incorporate nature and climate as assets that depreciate in value just like any asset does, if not maintained properly, and recognize that economies are embedded within nature and not, external to it. And he goes on to suggest various things that are somewhat climate negotiations-esque in how kind of pie in the sky they are, I think. International arrangements to manage certain environments, maybe creating agencies or funds. Often it seems like agencies and funds are what these kind of negotiations are designed to produce as their recommendations. But, systems of payments for nations that conserve their rainforests and so on. But I'm less concerned with what he and others have said, might be created than the philosophical question, which is that, we need to start valuing things correctly and to stop taking these inputs for granted, which is why I think really what I'm trying to get across today is that rather than money, it's that we need to make some fundamental changes, essentially, to economic models or ways that we think about the value of our businesses and our national products. which is, of course, really different than what these negotiations do. You know, they want to talk about the cost of essentially fixing climate change without discussing a fundamental change to the economic systems that produce climate change. And so their thinking seems to go that if we could just switch all energy production to something cleaner, then you could grow eternally. But I'm not convinced by that. I think, you know, for one thing, that's a very emissions, a kind of greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels centric way of looking at climate change. But that's far from the only source of global warming. Land use change is a huge factor. I'm sure all of you know, you know, that our rainforests are being cleared so that your future hamburgers can belch out methane on a scale that eclipses the emissions profiles of many independent countries. And as Sunil wrote in his book, nearly a tenth of global greenhouse gas emissions can be traced to the production of food that we then waste. It's just shocking to me, the scale of that. But about a third of our emissions come from agriculture and land use change. But another problem with the approach that's based just on money is that, frankly, we've kind of run out of time to be taking the status quo approach. I think that most climate scientists and honest appraisers of any kind of current emissions trajectories would tell you that we're almost surely locked into a future of more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages, and probably closer to 3. This morning I saw a report shared in our climate desk Slack that various financial institutions in their earnings statements and other disclosures to investors are openly saying that they expect, especially since Trump took office and has made decisions that he's made, that 3 degrees is well within reason. And you know that is a result of incredibly slow progress that we've made across multiple decades, and these decades, mind you, one after the other, 3 in a row, essentially, were referred to as the last decade, or the most important decade, or something that kind of felt equally terrifying and devoid of meaning at the same time, because what is the last decade? We do continue to have more and continue to need to address this. But our inability to has shown how making these broad-based changes and changes to economic models is something that we're really struggling with. And that goes for journalists as well. I think in the climate journalism sphere, we really don't write much about that. It feels too big. It feels too impossible. It feels like too few people are talking about it to even warrant writing about it. But anyways, bear with me. I said I was going to get to the shimmers of light, but we have a bit farther to go through the muck. So I kind of wanted to talk a bit about how we think about what we're going to write at the New York Times sometimes, or at least one way that we do it. We tend to have a conversation when we're thinking about global dynamics that touches on various dichotomies. One of them is, are democracies or autocracies better equipped to tackle this issue? And on one hand, you have democracies, theoretically more responsive form of government, where leaders might be answerable to constituents who maybe many of us in the room might be the kind of people who lie awake at night thinking about the planet's health and what the state of it might be when our children and grandchildren grow up. On the other hand, you have command economies like China's, without whom, after the past couple of decades, we can see that the global energy transition would be basically only there in theory, given their domination of the production of solar panels and wind turbines. But a government like that can identify looming problems many, many years in advance, and doesn't really have to justify huge changes that they might make or huge dislocations of populations that they might have to make happen to start, say, a vast new energy project. Another dichotomy is the capitalist versus socialist one. Ironically, in China, it's a certain kind of capitalism that's essentially driving that, their ability to turn into the electric empire, if you will. But it's also driving the long, long tail of coal use there, too, because it's still cheaper. And if you look to leftist governments in Latin America, let's say, over the past many decades, including people who we consider climate champions now, like Lula in Brazil, you would find rhetoric that in some ways actually is similar to Trump's. Our coal, our oil, are God-given gifts, and it's our right to extract them in the interest of our people's prosperity and in the interest of our ideological allies around the world. So all of that to say is basically no type of government is doing a wonderful job here. There are only a handful of countries in the whole world, mostly in Europe, where populations are shrinking and economies are growing very slowly, if at all, compared to, say, Brazil or India or China. Only those countries, and there are really only a few of them, are managing to stay on track to the original Paris Agreement pledges, which would keep the world at below 1.5 degrees of warming. And of course, they are now aware that that's not going to happen. And so they're ideologically wedded to doing this, but they're operating in a world where other countries are not catching up. This year, every country under the Paris Agreement is supposed to submit a new pledge for where they want their emissions to be by 2035. It happens every 5 years. And we're essentially expecting the biggest emitters, or some of them, like Japan and India and China, to give new pledges that all but accept that 2 or even higher than 2 degrees of Celsius of warming is inevitable. So all of that to say that we're going into our 30th UN climate conference this year in Brazil. And the man in charge of it, who's a longtime Brazilian diplomat and climate negotiator, was quoted as saying, "We need a new era beyond negotiating talks. We must put into practice what we've agreed." It's kind of like the most obvious thing in retrospect. He is leading these talks, and he's saying, we actually need a new era beyond this, which is really obvious if you're paying attention, because in the 30 years, this negotiating era, since the mid-90s, in those 30 years, more than half of all humans' cumulative carbon emissions have come in that time frame. That is the backdrop of these 3 decades of climate summits. And the ambition is now really low. I mean, that the same Brazilian politician who's in charge of this year's COP says that he doesn't really expect much more progress on, committing to phasing down fossil fuels or kind of creating new language around that, or really with wrangling the money to do it. He's said, let's focus on stemming deforestation because it's a quick fix, and it's one that he can win, he can make an easy political win this year in an era of exceptionally low expectations for climate action. You've all heard Greta Thunberg's new rallying cry, but I thought it was very effective when she started referring to these climate talks as a bunch of blah, blah, blah. It was obviously a pretty big departure for her. She, had started off much more earnest, but had become angrier and jaded. And this is, this is now years ago that she coined this. But after the talks in Glasgow, she commented that the negotiators had even managed to water down their own blah, blah, blah. Quite an achievement, she said. And I really can't help but feel the same when I finished writing that last piece on whatever the resolution is at the end of COP, and I'm lying in bed in my hotel. I find myself thinking year after year, like tens of thousands of people come here for 2 weeks, fly from all over and stay in these hotels and talk and talk and talk. And what have we really achieved? So perhaps it's pretty obvious, but yeah, I love covering climate negotiations. But yeah, here in the U.S., we're not even part of the Paris Agreement anymore. So I wanted to spend just a moment talking about what that looks like in practice and what the U.S. government's current stance on this is, given that the U.S. is obviously the world's biggest economy. It certainly has the capacity to be the biggest of the rich countries contributing to poorer countries' ability to adapt or do their own energy transitions. And so to get into it, I thought I would recount this trip that I took to DC a couple weeks ago to attend a speech that was given by the U.S.'s new energy secretary, Chris Wright, who's a former fracking executive and a very passionate public speaker who, unlike me, can speak at great length about energy and climate off the cuff without looking at his notes. He's really, I mean, he's amazing to hear speak. He's very passionate. And in this instance, he was standing in front of a room of African energy officials, people from the departments of energy of their countries or from companies that do oil and gas or renewables, who are all coming to Washington to find out what does the Trump administration think about energy development in Africa, given that many successive administrations before this one have kind of insisted that Africa leapfrog and go past, from many people not having electricity at all to getting it from renewable energy and not from fossil fuels. But essentially what Secretary Wright told the crowd was what they wanted to hear, which is that the US will no longer consider climate change when investing in African energy projects. And he kind of begrudgingly said, look, I studied climate science in university. It's a real phenomenon, but it's being weaponized against poor people in the world and holding them back from development. And he said, and I quote, "If we're being honest, climate change isn't even in the top 10 biggest issues facing the world." And the following week, he went to Houston, where annual oil and gas conference takes place, and he told a room full of fossil fuel executives there that climate change was, quote, a side effect of building the modern world, which of course it is. I don't dispute that. And he's basically saying that everything in life involves trade-offs, and you don't get prosperity without climate change. So whether he meant to or not, Secretary Wright is putting his finger on the conundrum that kind of underlies everything that I've been trying to say up to this point, which is that it's very hard to convince the world's most privileged people and companies and countries whose power derives from the extractive plunder of the world's resources that those same forces might bring about ruin. They don't want to accept that they've been greedy. And his, Secretary Wright's coping mechanism, it seems, is kind of a form of denialism. If you can just convince yourself that climate change is a side effect, then yes, of course, using climate change as an argument to fundamentally change economic systems, as I am right now, is suspicious. Yeah, it's something that feels conspiratorial. If it's not even in the top 10 things to worry about, then why would we change our whole system? And that's the same argument that makes it very easy to tear up the Paris Agreement, which Trump has claimed to be costing the US trillions of dollars. But the truth is that the actual trillions of dollars that the US and the global economy are losing are due, that is due to climate change. That is one reason why we are facing such economic headwinds right now. A recent study by BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, and Cambridge showed that climate change could reduce cumulative global GDP by up to 34% by the end of this century if we continued on our current emissions trajectories. The UN predicts that more than 1 billion people will be forced to relocate before 2050 due to climate-related pressures. Inflation and food prices will be harder and harder to tame, which continuously would throw politics and all of our lives into kind of unceasing uncertainty. So yeah, the political context feels grim, of course. Amid everything that I'm saying, I haven't really offered yet a place to look. Like, who are we meant to look to if not states and their climate negotiators, if not a certain kind of political system, then who, right? Like venture capitalists or crypto bros or who? So yeah, to the shimmers of light, and I'm like genuinely astonished at myself that I'm saying this, but I actually see the shimmers of light in the market, which is to say things like sovereign wealth funds, private equity firms, and insurance companies, like the most selfless, best people in the world, of course. But okay, to be clear, I'm not saying that I trust these institutions to be stewards of life on Earth. But what I do have is an expectation that these types of financial institutions, who are the most sensitive to losing money, are actually already on the cusp of understanding that their current ways of valuing assets, as I was talking about before, it has a massive hole in it. And I'll give you some examples. So Norway's sovereign wealth fund, which has almost $2 trillion in assets, recently placed 96% of all of its assets in its entire portfolio under natural capital risk assessment, which is to say that climate risks are going to be incorporated into their decisions around investments in nearly their entire portfolio. The Financial Accounting Standards Foundation in Japan, which is a government body, mandated that all public companies in Japan have to account for climate and nature risks in their portfolios. Bloomberg, which operates, as you might know, the financial system's main data terminals that every kind of trader and investor has on their desk or on their computer, recently incorporated the Natural History Museum's Biodiversity Intactness Index in each of those terminals to help investors and traders assess nature-related impacts and dependencies across 45,000 companies. Even Morgan Stanley and BlackRock are coming out with new initiatives to reassess the value of companies that they invest in by incorporating the same thing that we've been talking about, natural assets. And you know, the ones that know it the best, and this might not be a surprise to you, are insurance companies, which are literally watching entire swathes of this country and other places in the world become impossible for them to make money off of. So it's changes like these, and they're relatively new, that make me wonder, if not hope, if it might be these most ardent purveyors, actually, of the current economic order that we have, who, because they are looking at their balance sheets, are actually most keenly aware of the toll of climate change, much more so than politicians or tech magnates. And I think it's a kind of accurate reflection of how power works in the world, too. The powerful make the rules are seldom designed to diminish their power. But in this case, some of the most powerful people in the world are realizing that climate change may diminish their power. So maybe they will decide to change the rules. So I'm not saying all of this to maybe offer a hopeful vision necessarily. There would be institutions that I would trust much more to make these new rules. There are ways that I think would be more durable to make the kinds of changes that I'm talking about, to react to climate change more quickly. And, you know, again, as in most cases of decision making, the general public, let alone the poor, are not in this room. They're not even in the building. They're not even on the same continent, really. But I guess what I'm saying here is that, you know, I kind of want to walk back the title of this talk. You know, why are the rich failing the poor? Because the poor are being failed. Absolutely. You know, they're suffering the brunt of decades of abysmally slow action, even as the evidence of climate change has become overwhelmingly clear. But the fix, or the solution, if we can even call it that, is, I think, most likely to come from the rich realizing that they're not just failing the poor, but they're failing themselves. To nod to Sunil's book one more time, in the beginning of it, he says, and I'm paraphrasing, that this whole mess started when the world's most privileged people started believing very deeply, developing entire cosmologies around this belief that they could conquer nature. But I think what we need now is for the world's most privileged people to abandon that belief and come to terms with the fact that this is a battle they can't win. Thank you.
So wonderful. So now I'm going to invite Max and our fellow panelist, Sunil Amrith, to the front. So Sunil Amrith is the Renu and Anand Dhawan Professor of History at Yale University. He's also the director of the Macmillan Center. He's a historian initially of South Asia, and then of South Asia and the environment, and then of environmental history, and now of environmental history of the entire world. So he's run out of scope to expand his ambition, but at each stage has written sort of incredibly insightfully about the vagaries of nature, human exposure to environmental impacts, and how those environmental impacts and changes have been exacerbated by political systems, colonialism, and human action. So there's hardly any more relevant history to what Max is describing as far as the impact of climate change today. So I'm going to sort of join the panelists, and as I do, I just want to sort of put an initial question to Sunil. So in your book, in the passage that Max has mentioned, you talk particularly of the notion of this unshackling, that the kind of key inflection point in environmental history was when people became technologically sophisticated enough, wealthy enough perhaps, that it changed their mindset towards the environment. Could you just describe that process and what you think its consequences have been?
I think, as Max gestured to at the end of the talk, most people have never had that luxury of being able to imagine themselves somehow exempt or immune from the living planet. But I think there's a very powerful strand of that kind of thinking which you see escalating from maybe the middle of the 19th century. It's not a direct consequence of industrialization, but you certainly start to see when industrial capitalism and empire come together, when the sheer power of some societies and those who rule those societies to conquer swathes of the world, to command resources on every continent, almost at will. I mean, Keynes writes about this at the end of the First World War, and it's self-critical on his part, but he's sort of saying, we really did believe until 1914 that the average London merchant could pick up the phone and purchase or speculate on commodities from every corner of the world. And Keynes points out that the First World War brings this crashing down. And there are other moments in the 20th century when, of course, geopolitics asserts itself and leads to privation and a sudden intense awareness of how dependent we are on the earth and its resources. Certainly you see that during the First World Wars, but I think there is this strain. And I grew up in Singapore, the end of the 20th century, in the 1980s, 1990s, and Singapore is a great example of this. I mean, Singapore's land area has grew 25% in my own lifetime from reclaimed land. Singapore's first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew says at the beginning of this century that he thinks the most important invention of the 20th century is air conditioning. And it's about that insulation. It's about that capacity to remold and to reshape the planet for human comfort and for human flourishing. And I don't want to sort of underplay the often liberatory intentions behind that mindset. But that mindset, of course, well, it meets its match with the climate crisis.
And so just to tie it back to Max's description of the reception of the Energy Secretary's speech. So in your article, and I think this is one thing I sort of admire in your work, you also described that the Energy Secretary described the United States supporting an all-of-the-above approach to energy in Africa, that is investment in all sort of fossil-based as well as renewable energy systems. And your phrase, if I have the word correct, was that there was a rapturous reception for this. That is, the appetite for this unshackling, which Sunil describes, is very strong, yes. And the reception is very positive. And of course, people want sort of cheap energy, and there's no reason that should be withheld or denied. So why do you think the reception is so strong? And is it, foolish to push back against this tide, which is in any case just the tide of development and progress, and people wanting the same thing that richer countries have had before them?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is that I think it's obvious that any person living in the world would want the benefits and the joys of modernity. You go to a village that has just received electricity and watch the things that people do with it, and it's amazing. I mean, a lot of it is about joy. It's about living happily. It's about buying a refrigerator so that your beer can be cold, and how much that changes your mood. And it's about so many other things, and we talk a lot about economic development, but it's that too. But the rapturous response from these energy officials who represent a continent where 700 million people don't have access to electricity is because they're deeply impatient to develop their energy systems and want to do it in whatever way possible. And I think where it gets tricky is, they are right to be excited that Secretary Wright came out and said, we may have killed USAID and killed Power Africa, which was the kind of investment mechanism with that, but we're still actually going to invest a ton in African energy. Okay, that's very exciting. But I think where it gets a bit tricky is that renewable energy, in particular solar and solar mini grids and solar home systems, have become so much quicker and easier to deploy rapidly that would be the way to do it, I think, to do it really quickly, and not to build over the course of decades huge new fracking fields and refineries and pipelines and then the most difficult of all, transmission lines and grids to bring that power out to everybody. So it's, he's certainly got an industry that he would like to still have an entrance point into the developing world with.
So then if that's the case, if the way to do it is solar, and solar's gotten incredibly cheap, so basically the only domain of the physical world where you can think that Moore's law is roughly applying, things are getting cheaper, say, by a factor of 3 or 5 in a decade, and now for 30 years or 50 years, then should we be so threatened by the all of the above approach? Maybe he throws the gates open, but in fact, solar is now competitive, and the environmental consequences are beneficial, and people invest, and supported by the government, agnostic to technology, it can outcompete on its own terms.
I think it's a question of how quick the energy transition can go. It's to keep us on certain warming trajectories, it needs to go so fast, and every kind of major turn away from it is one that eats into what is now an infinitesimally small carbon budget that we have before we pass certain inevitabilities in terms of warming. And so there is a world in which solar power in particular becomes so cheap and easy to produce that it's not just being produced in China, but Indonesia and Nigeria and South Africa are easily ripping off the IP and making it there. But I don't know. That seems not likely to happen in 5 or even 10 years, and even that is a long time to wait. So.
Okay, so too fast, perhaps, or too worrisome how fast. So let me just take the second thing you noted from the Secretary's speech, this idea that climate change was the side effect of building the modern world. That was quite provocative. I think in Sunil's book, also in his broader work, I do see some commonality in the sense that there are many, many instances where environmental harms were a means of transmission for colonialism and had very harmful, destructive effects, but in some cases generally did seem to be side effects, like the Colombian plague as one leading example, devastated populations in North America, but it's not that the people carrying European diseases knew it as such when they were coming over. So, do you feel like that's a fair characterization, that there have been many such instances of environmental harm brought about by humans, but which were not so intended?
I think in some ways you can see a significant proportion of the environmental harm of the last 100 or 200 years is not directly intended, in the sense that so many of the ends that people have pursued have been, we could call them noble ones or liberatory ones, at least for a certain group of people. I talk about India in the 1940s, 1950s. Life expectancy at independence in India was just over 30 years. And yes, looking back, we can see that there have been all kinds of unintended consequences of some of the approaches to top-down environmentally harmful development that the Indian state and then later on, Indian capitalists have undertaken. But I don't think there's any denying the transformation, the conditions and possibilities of life that have come from that. I suppose the question we're always asking is, which of these environmental harms are just wantonly destructive? And I think there's plenty of that as well. Which of them have to do with the enrichment of a very small number of people or a very small social group? And which of them, arguably some of the most transformative environmental transformations have to do with the ecology of water. I'm not sure we would see that as environmental harm in the same way, whether that's malaria control or whether that's providing clean drinking water. I mean, those are massive environmental transformations, and they do have to do with achieving a level of control. But we're distinguishing that from the kinds of harms that come from, particularly from mass deforestation.
And just to press on this, so like the massive benefits from sanitation, from improved control of water, these come about from the same sort of mindset of unshackling, that one could have dominion over nature, and it's been enormously successful in these domains. So then we come back to this question, and Max is describing that the only countries that have succeeded in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions are doing so by shrinking or at a very small scale, where what we need is at a broader scale, a new way of growing. So is it not that the only way out is through, as opposed to a sort of mindset of degrowth, which is where I think economists and other commentators concerned about climate diverge, that perhaps yes, there will be additional harm, but ultimately it's technology that has solved these problems, and pushing ahead rather than trying to constrain people's choices.
Could I just add a question to that for Max, Nick, if you don't mind, which is what is your take on the sort of rapid progress towards forms of solar geoengineering as one example of a kind of, the only way out is through in the reporting that you've done?
I think, again, it's a similar answer actually to the one about solar energy, which is so much farther along than a lot of the geoengineering, whether it's direct air capture or spraying aerosols or what have you. Or developing fusion energy or something like that. We can hope that those things happen really quickly and that the technology and the science around them develops very quickly. But it doesn't seem to be happening all that quickly. And so, those are the routes that we have in mind when we think of unfettered growth. We can now just split atoms at will and have limitless energy. And if we don't use that to destroy ourselves, then we'll just grow indefinitely. But I think that, from the people that I talked to, and we had a series of articles on this last year, that's still just theory.
Just to comment or slightly, you mentioned the people that I talked to, and I think one of the striking things, as I noted again about your journalism, is this kind of voyage from the ground to the COP and in between. I wonder if you could just describe sort of methodologically or sort of in your mind, how does that inform your point of view? Why is it important that you're speaking to a business owner who has lost his business or property in a flood in Pakistan, or speaking to somebody in the Amazon who might benefit from deforestation? How does it change your view, as opposed to I guess at the COP process, 90% of the people there are not doing the same thing.
No, yeah, they're not. I think that you need to do that to understand, various forms of the human condition, and that in doing so, you understand what are our basic yearnings. And, that's kind of why I bring up, this job has taken me to so many places that have just gotten electricity,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just such an interesting thing to watch. What are the impulses that we begin with when we want energy, and then when they go very far, and then you get into the territory of what Sunil is talking about, the unshackling, what is the through line there? And I think when you understand that through line of how you start with wanting a refrigerator, first to just have a cold drink, and then maybe to sell the cold drinks, and then to have 2 refrigerators, and then you kind of start seeing how we're all kind of the same, and once you get that, then maybe it becomes easier to develop economic models that safeguard against our impulses, or at least incorporate better, as I was saying, the many, many natural inputs that go into fulfilling our impulses.
I'll just comment, because I did on this. I've studied electrification and collected survey data from a lot of people in rural Bihar from about 2013, when very few Biharis had electricity, to 2017, when many did. And the number one item that people wanted to plug in was their mobile phone, surprising basically no one. Any guess for number 2? No? Television? It was not television. Refrigerator? No. Light bulb, yes. Number 2 is light bulb, behind mobile phone. Because after all, your screen can glow on its own. So yeah, it's profound how common these desires, these things are across the world. So I want to sort of leave enough time for comments and questions from the audience. So perhaps we could open it now and see what you would like to know from the panel. Shall we distribute a microphone?
Yes, no problem.
All right, thanks very much.
I could probably just project because I'm a professor with a loud voice, but I'll wait.
Yeah, for those online, it's helpful.
Testing, testing. Thank you so much. I'm Dawn Basie, and I'm actually the Fulbright Canada professor here for the year at Yale. And I'm also the contact point for my university, my home university, for COP. So I got us accreditation, COP 17, and we keep sending people back and back and back. And now I'm in the room at ITBES, which is the Ecosystem Services Biodiversity Negotiations, in the room at CBD. So I've been there, and it's boring to watch these people dicker over the definition of an invasive species. But what I really want to ask you is about the Stern report. It's 20 years since Nicholas Stern came out with that report. And recently, we had Bill Morneau, the former finance minister of Canada, here a few weeks ago. And his daughter does climate finance and stuff and sustainability. She was here as an undergraduate. And we were sort of chatting afterwards. And I said, you need to go back to the Stern report. Could you just, I'm trying to sneak into two questions. Have you ever thought back to the Stern report? And has any of that changed? Because I think he nailed it with, and the reinsurance companies were testifying in front of Congress 20 plus years ago about all the insurance implications. But the other thing that I want that you haven't touched on, and this is for me the most important thing, is everyone in the world can have 2 fridges, but in the last 5 years, and Oxfam has reported on this, is the concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer billionaires. So what we've seen is the poorest people have become substantially poorer, and they are the people who are going to be most disproportionately affected by it. It's in The Guardian. The Guardian did an article about it a year ago. And I think that's a huge part of it, is we've got the tech bros, you mentioned the tide. How did that go for King Canute? He didn't hold it back, but they really do believe.
So is there a question?
So the question is, where is that piece in this? The concentration of wealth, because we're talking about the technology. I think the real issue is about the financial motivations of these people, and they don't want what you're talking about. And they've pulled us out, putting out, and is Stern still relevant? So 2 quick questions, long questions.
I'm not sure if I would say Stern report is, it's certainly prescient, but what you've described in terms of massive increasing inequality makes it less and less relevant. And of course, political dynamics have changed massively since then too. I don't think that that foresaw what would happen in China and the growth of its renewable energy prowess and how that's changing the energy transition. But I think I would probably disagree and say that, I think what I'm trying to allude to, and I know that it's not a very hopeful thing to say, is that bit by bit, the people that control gajillions of dollars in assets, who are the beneficiaries of the widening gulf of inequality, are beginning to see that they are losing money in some places if they don't think about the degradation of nature and of the climate when they think about what they're going to invest in. And if you kind of do those investments or stock trading without thinking about the vulnerability of any given asset or system to natural risk and climate change, well then it's a massive blind spot and you're going to lose money. And so I think those changes over time will help redirect a lot of money to much more climate resilient growth. That doesn't mean that climate change is going to be solved. And that's why I'm saying it's not necessarily a hopeful message or solution that I'm giving, but I do think that that's one way that the rich world, if you will, can start serving the poor world better, is just by thinking about this and acknowledging it.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Andy Creel. I'm a 4th-year PhD student at the School of the Environment, and I'm studying natural capital accounting. And so hearing you reference the Scooter report at the beginning of your talk made me feel like I was on the right track. But I'm in my 4th year, and I'm at a pivot point, and looking around, there are a couple other people studying environmental economics here. And the reason I went into the environmental field was a desire to have an impact. The reason I went into economics is I thought it was a tool to achieve that. But now in my 4th year, facing a grim job market from most angles, I'm trying to think about where to go next. And I was really interested in your shimmers, like you were describing, and I was hoping you could describe a little bit, one, the role of academia, where I've spent most of my 20s, but also if you could talk a bit more as well about the impact you do think that equity could have, private equity firms could have on this. Because those are the 2 paths that I'm starting to contrast. So it's a selfish question, but I think there are other people in the room who are wondering this. What are the roles of staying in academia? What are the roles of leaving? Mm-hmm. What's the pace required?
Sure. Yeah, and maybe Nick, you could speak more to the academia part of it than I. But and Rohini Pande, Professor Pande, who's here, would be a good one to talk to also about the shifting dynamics in the carbon market, which so far has been, I think, frankly, kind of disappointing in a lot of ways. but still holds a lot of promise. And I come to carbon markets because you asked about equity and about some of this big money, and I think that eventually the shimmers that I'm describing will lead a lot of that big money, essentially people who are managing large amounts of assets, to invest in that market as it becomes, as the foundation of it gets built on better data, and as the concept of natural capital and natural capital risk become more widespread, you'll start having these companies, this is me saying this with fingers crossed, but you'll have financial institutions like that not only see, forests, let's say, that are about to be chopped down as worth protecting, but we were talking about this before I spoke, but maybe might be able to see a really remote tract of rainforest as worth essentially buying as an asset, because it produces an ecosystem service that benefits the 45,000 companies that Morgan Stanley is invested in, or something like that. That it sucks in the carbon, keeps, regulates global temperatures, that these things get built into a broader system. Now, does that happen soon enough for while you're entering the job market, or even in our lifetimes? Those are both open questions. But I think for someone studying something like you are, trying to build momentum behind that shift is really important.
Yeah. So I will also weigh in. So I think that practically, a lot of the negative aspects that Max has brought out about a lack of progress have been in government domains and in domains of coordination, and the positive things we're able to point to a large extent have been progress in technology, progress that has come about because of private incentives to invest. So the benefit, of course, of working in the private sector is it acts much more quickly, it acts sort of confidently, and it acts at scale because there's an enormous amount of money that can be devoted to anything which is profitable. So if solar becomes profitable, then that invests at scale, and if reinsurance companies decide to change their risk rating for wildfires in California, then that immediately has an aspect on, impact on where housing can be built. And so these things happen very quickly. The trade-off for that is that you don't get to set the agenda of what you work on, and in academia or in these broader fields, you have the ability, like if you are Sunil, for example, to step back and set a conceptual agenda for how people even think about or conceive of these issues of the human relation to the environment. If, at a more humble scale, you are like me, an economist, you can work on things that people don't otherwise have an incentive to work on. They don't make any money from that, but might help improve, reduce emissions, improve efficiency by changing the rules of the game. So, for example, how does an electricity market work? It's not a very contentious or politically forward issue, but there are a lot of these aspects of the plumbing of markets, how they work, what information people have, how the rules change over time, how do they accommodate renewable energy growth, how do you regulate pollution, where there's a lot of, as Esther Duflo coined, plumbing going on, and we need very good plumbers, and plumbers who have a mind to how the market functions and not just how much their firm makes money. So, but I mean, tell me if I've given a characterization, or I stepped outside my lane.
I thought that was profound. Okay. It was brilliant.
Hello, my name is Bethel. I'm an undergraduate student at Yale, and I have sort of a threefold question, but hopefully it's all concise. My first question is related to what you were just talking about. I was wondering if you have an estimate on what this timeline would look like in this economic shift, and if you think that the timeline hopefully outpaces this urgency that we have. My second question is, when you talk about the mindset shift and how we value and think about businesses, is it solely through this sort of incorporation of a climate risk factor, or are there other mechanisms that specifically change this valuation? And then lastly, do you see any consequences in making an infra calculation? You were just talking about this idea of being able to act boldly and the private sector being able to act more quickly, which is a positive thing in many ways, but also this idea of if the action is sort of a miscalculation or a misstep, what that might entail.
Right. In terms of a timeline, one way to think about it is I think the New York Times, for instance, would like to think of itself as covering everything and being on top of things. I don't think what I've just described here, this kind of shift, has gotten almost any coverage. I'm actually trying to do some of that next month. And I think that that's an indication of just how early on we are in this timeline. These things can explode and move really fast. Some of the biggest asset managers in the world are talking about this, and obviously it's an idea that's catching on. There are international conferences about it. There are people who are doing their PhDs on it. It's a real thing, and there is momentum there. But I think it'd be hard to say, just like it is with direct air capture or something like that, how quickly it happens. It depends on momentous breakthroughs or agreements or some asset manager acting really boldly, or governments requiring it. And to your, could you repeat this second question of yours?
Yes, the second question was about, are there other ways you see this mindset, this paradigm shift?
I think in the halls of big money, not so much. I think that there's actually, one of the big issues in the big money world when it comes to climate change is that the most important sector is the energy sector, and there's still a huge amount of money to be made in fossil fuels, and they're making more money than ever and producing more of them than ever. And so the financial incentives around the main causes of the climate crisis, and that goes for our meat consumption as well, which is continuing to go through the roof. Those financial incentives are not changing in the same way. It's kind of like a reverse effect where climate change's effects are forcing some action, while at the same time its causes are still incentivized, which is why I say that it's a really perplexing moment in some ways. And I think to your third question, or at least as how I understood it, and this goes to your question as well about academia, a lot of the progress around stemming deforestation or building a carbon market or investing in natural capital assets comes down to really good data and understanding, for instance, how much carbon is in a hectare of forest, or how much does changing the way that you till soil affect how much is emitted from it. And understanding all of that intricately is really important, and a really important function of both academia, but also of this changing dynamic. It incentivizes academics to also produce that data and study it, because that's where the momentum is.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to sort of end things here, but thank you for coming, and let's warmly thank our panelists.